Good morning, sophomores. It's a rainy day in Grants Pass, and well, that's a good day to talk about the Great Depression. So, we are going to dive into that story today because it's one of the critical events of the 20th century. And we are about to dive into the rise of dictators in World War II, and you can't understand that without understanding a little bit about the Great Depression. Now, you'll probably hear more about this next year in American history from an American perspective. But the Great Depression was a global event, and it affected every country in the world. And, we have some sense of that, perhaps right now, seeing global events like we're living in right now that can really change the course of history. So let's take a look at the Great Depression. What was it? What caused it? And what were some of its effects? We have two essential questions as we're looking at this issue. What was the cause of the Great Depression? What can we learn from that? And a few years ago, we had a recession, and there were some similarities and there were some differences. So not every recession or depression or in the cycle of the economy is identical, but there are some commonalities we can learn. And what are the effects, and how do people respond to the Great Depression? The Great Depression will change the nature of capitalism itself. It'll cause other countries to turn toward more radical solutions. So this is part of our unit in chapter 18, or the section you're reading right now, which covers not just the Great Depression, but also the rise of dictators leading to World War II. So it's set in this bigger story. Some people say the Great Depression caused the rise of dictators, but as you'll see, in 1922, Benito Mussolini took over Italy long before the Great Depression happened. Germany was a democracy when the Great Depression occurred and turned to Adolf Hitler. And so we'll see that there is a relationship there, but it may not be as simple as some people think. People didn't just become Nazis because they were broke. I mean, not every poor person, not every country in recession becomes Nazis. But there is a connection. So we're going to explore that as we go down the road here. We should also point out that there was a major recession in Europe, that Europe had actually had two economic downturns between World War I and World War II. One was immediately after World War I. As much as Europe is devastated, and the United States has become the #1 economic power. The Europeans on the winning side are in recession, and they have borrowed and will continue to borrow from the United States. And countries like Germany on the losing side also will borrow from the United States. What that is going to mean is that if the United States goes into a depression, everybody else will be affected, because after 1918, the United States is the world's #1 economy. A position it still more or less holds today, although with some rising challenges in places like China and perhaps the EU. Remember, this is also while Stalin is taking over the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets will say, well, we never went through depression. That's why communism works. But the reality is that communism is like one big, long, permanent depression. And I'm not just being biased there. If you look at the economic statistics, the Soviet economy was already at the bottom. It's just the capitalist economy has dropped toward it for a time being during the Depression. The Depression is going to affect Japan, as we'll see. It's going to give the Japanese army an opening in 1931 to take over power from a civilian government. Another thing about the Depression is we say it began in 1929, but it doesn't really hit Europe very hard until 1930, 1931, when major European banking systems begin to collapse. So there is a bit of a delayed effect. Ultimately, though, both the Germans and the Americans make major governmental changes. In Germany, in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes the chancellor. We'll explore that in our next lecture. And in America, the United States chose a new kind of president, Franklin Roosevelt, who saw a new role for government, being more active in dealing with the economy. We'll explore that a little bit in this lecture, and of course, you'll talk about it much more next year. So, some things about the Great Depression to understand before we get into the causes, and that's what's going on in the 1920s. As we said, the United States is the dominant economy. It is a creditor nation. If you're a country, you either owe other countries or they owe you. The United States becomes the #1 creditor. Everybody owes us. That's a good position. It's better than you owing money to somebody else. But even as being the richest country, in 1928, 60% of Americans still fell below the poverty line. Now, that's good compared to the 19th century. It's not good compared to us now. So although our economy will go down, and in fact, as we will see, Far more people are poor in America in 1933 than in 1928. Today, most of us are still in the middle class. And so poverty and being below the poverty line is about 15 to 20% of most Western societies. But 60% being poor would have been normal. So you can imagine how much the Depression affected people by putting many more people in this category of poverty. It really was a big deal. During this time period in the 1920s, though, when America is doing well, more people are moving into the middle class. And a lot of people are now able to play in the stock market, especially with stockbrokers using the telegraph. You don't have to physically be in the stock market to play it. And so a lot of middle class people begin investing in the stock market. And since America's booming, the economy is going up, this is the roaring 20s, it seems like it doesn't matter what stock you buy, you're going to make money. Just like in the early 2000s, people said it doesn't matter what you pay for a house, it's going to gain value. You can flip it or sell it later. As you can imagine, this is not going to work out very well. And in fact, one of the things to remember is that in America, there were still about 40% of us that were farmers. And the problem is that farming was already in a recession by 1926. Farmers were simply growing too much. They were too good at what they were doing. It's a combination of factors. They'd grown a lot of food for the Army in World War I, and they kept right on growing it. They had new tractors. They had new science. They just got better at growing more food. But the problem is if you flood the market with your product, if you have too much of it, you actually drive the price down. So that by 1925, 1926, you see farmers destroying their crops, dumping their milk because they simply can't sell it anymore. If it's costing them 30 cents a gallon to make milk, but they can only sell it for 20 cents a gallon, you're losing money by being productive. It sounds counterintuitive, but this is a problem. And so although we say the Great Depression began in America in 1929 based on the October 1929 stock market crash, the reality is the country already had some serious issues. It looked good on the surface, but underneath, it's in trouble. The big symptom was the October 1929 stock market collapse. Stock market collapse did not cause the Great Depression any more than your fever causes you to have the flu. It's really the other way around. The stock market collapse was a symptom of the problems and the sickness that was already there. When you wake up with a fever in the morning, you've already been sick, you just didn't know it. And that's kind of what the stock market collapse was. This causes the United States to cut off loans and investments to the whole world. If we're losing money, we're not loaning it to other countries. We're not investing in other countries because we're going, oh no, we're losing money. We got to hang on to our cash. That's how the Great Depression then ripples out. If we are the bankers of the world and we collapse, everybody goes down with us. So that's kind of the Great Depression in a nutshell. But I want to kind of break it down for you. This next slide is going to be a little complicated, but I'm going to walk it through you little by little. And maybe you can even pause and stare at it for a minute, just kind of as we're going along, just to keep things going in your head. Of course, you should be reading the chapter, which will also help. So let's think about the various things that caused the Great Depression. Going back to the 1920s, easy credit. Banks are giving away money. People are buying things like crazy. This is when appliances become a thing, washing machines. People are buying these, and they're buying them on credit, on what they call the installment plan. Today we use credit cards. You put 10% down, I'll pay the rest later because I'm making more money all the time. It's going to be awesome. I can pay for this later. The problem is easy credit causes people to buy things they probably can't actually afford. A bigger house than they need, a new car when they can't really afford it, because they don't feel the pain of buying it in the moment and they think they can spread it out, and we're optimistic that we can make those payments in the future. Since people are buying, factories are cranking out goods. And since factories are cranking out goods and people are buying, companies are making money. So if you want to buy stock in a washing machine company or Ford Motor Company or the new movie companies, hey, they seem to be making money. If I buy $100 worth of stock today, I'll make $200 tomorrow. It's only going to go up. I can't lose. And it's that kind of false optimism that begins to create an overheated economy. Things are climbing, climbing, climbing. The problem is what goes up tends to come down. Now, as we said already, farmers are already in trouble. There's some of the people who are buying. They're buying new tractors and they're buying and building new houses for a while when things are going well. But then all of a sudden, the prices start dropping. They can't make their payments on that new tractor. And again, we should also remember that another problem is that all these companies making things are really having to sell them to 40% of the country, because 60% of people are still poor. They can't buy this stuff. If you can only sell your things to 40% of the country, you're going to run out of customers. But if you can sell your things to 100% of the country, because very few people are poor, you're going to make more money. So why should we want people to be helped out of poverty? Well, if you're a capitalist, if you can help people out of poverty, you create new customers. So the problem is we have massive poverty in America still in the 1920s. Now, while that was better than the 1720s, it's still not a good number in a growing capitalist economy. By 1929, all of these forces collide. People stop buying things. They don't need to buy a third car. They don't need to buy a second car. The farmers can't make their payments, so they cut back on their purchasing. And so generally people say, I've either got too much, or I've got enough, or I'm overextended on credit, or I can't make the payments of stuff I've already bought. And all those things cause people to stop buying. We're seeing some of this now. People are getting laid off. People are worried about the future. When people are worried, even if they don't have to worry, but they worry anyway, their behavior is they stop buying as much stuff. Well, that's going to create a spiraling effect in the economy. When people stop buying, profits drop. Now, right at this moment, governments around the world do something that makes things worse. They say, oh no, people aren't buying stuff made in England, so let's tax goods from other countries, from America, from France, from Germany, so that the English goods will be cheaper and people in England will buy English. In America, buy American. The problem is everybody starts doing that to each other. And so American companies are saying, man, we're not selling enough to American consumers. Oh, but we can sell stuff overseas. All of a sudden they realize their stuff overseas is now being double and triple taxed. These are called tariffs. A tariff is a tax on a foreign good. And of course, that means they stop selling things over there. So they're losing customers at home. They're losing customers abroad. And that means they're going to stop production. They're going to say, stop making so much stuff. We can't sell what we have. If your factories aren't producing, you're going to start laying people off. And this is where the spiral downwards really begins to kick in. Meanwhile, the problem with easy credit is some people make stupid loans. If a bank is giving out credit without really investigating the people borrowing the money, they're going to loan money to people who couldn't pay it back, who could have never paid it back. And now the banks want their money back, and they're like, I haven't got any money, I can't pay it back. I borrowed too much. Well, the money in a bank is from the people who put the money in the bank. So now that bank has lost the money of its depositors. If you want to see a great old movie on this, watch It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, about a neighborhood bank in the Great Depression, and how a bank is really using your money to loan to other people so they can make money off the interest. So if a bank's paying you 2% interest, they're probably charging somebody 20% interest. That's why bankers drive nice cars. But if they lose their depositors' money, not only did the bank lose money, you lost money, okay? And so this is going to create a problem with the banking system. This happens at the same time as factories stop production. If factories aren't producing, they're not making profit. And if they're not making profit, the value of their stock begins to drop. And the problem is, if lots of companies' stock is going down because a lot of companies aren't producing, then on the stock market, people say, uh-oh, I paid $100 for this stock, it's worth $200, and now it's dropping to $180, I think I'm going to sell it. But if everybody else is selling and nobody's buying, what do? Oh, nobody's buying at 180. I'll drop it to 150. I'll drop it to 120. I'll drop it to 100. At least I'll get back what I paid for it. Nobody's buying, everybody's selling. Okay, how about 80 bucks, 70, 50, 20, right? And you're losing money. The money you invest in that stock is disappearing. And some companies go out of business altogether, and you're left holding stock in a company that doesn't exist. You have lost your investment. Okay, so what happens? Banks begin to collapse. Banks that have invested in the stock market or made stupid loans or sometimes just people who got laid off and were doing fine, but now they can't pay back their loan. And one of the problems is when people get laid off, they go running to the bank. It's called a run on the bank. They all want their money at the same time. By the way, banks are collapsing, no credit, which means no loans. No loans mean we're not building new factories, we're not creating new jobs. So when people get laid off in a general recession, and that means there's nowhere else for them to go. You have massive unemployment. In fact, by 1932, somewhere between 40 or 50% of Americans were unemployed. And we're really fuzzy on the numbers because of how they tracked it. Sometimes the numbers look better than 40 or 50%, but we know that the government was actually not reporting a lot of people because of the way they did the numbers. Anyway, the point is lots of people unemployed. Okay? Massive unemployment. Now, probably with this coronavirus, we're going to see the economy revive here, hopefully in a couple months, but this depression is going to last for over 10 years. This is why it's called the Great Depression, not a recession, but a depression. A very long-term, big drop in the economy, massive unemployment. Of course, people run to the bank and the bank say, here's your money, until they run out. Well, if they've lost your money, somebody in that line is going to get to the window and say, I want my money. And they're going to say, yeah, we just ran out. We don't have any more. What do you mean you don't have any more? It's my money. Yeah, well, we lost it. You were just number 27 in line and the first 26 people got theirs and now we're out of cash. You mean you lost my money? We lost your money, right? And so that's going to create a major panic. This is why people from the Depression, that survived, put money in a can and bury it in the backyard and say, I don't trust banks, right? So now, I will tell you, since then, we have done things to back up banks, but those didn't exist in those days. There's very little social safety nets or backing up by the government for the financial system. So people were just out of luck. This is a really tough situation, and it's going to last for a long time all over the world, because as the American economy collapses, the loans from America that are helping other countries build and start companies are going to dry up. And also, as people are getting unemployed, their economies are going to go through the same thing, and you're going to have massive unemployment. Okay, so you might want to pause here and look at this diagram for a minute. I know it's a little complicated, but there's a chain reaction here we're trying to describe. So what's the effect of all of this? The effect is very real human suffering. Very difficult situation. Okay, so there you can, I'm moving my little picture around so you can hopefully see the whole chart. Okay, so what are the effects? Global trade drops by 36%. 1/3 of all global trade dries up by 1932. Trade within the United States, just business back and forth, down by 62%. Unemployment in Britain and France, not as much, about 25% unemployment. They had already some social safety nets. In America, as we said, 40-50%. Japan as high as 60%. Okay, 2/3 of the Japanese with no work to do. They relied heavily on exporting raw materials to other countries who no longer want to buy those raw materials because there's no factories to process them. Colonies and poor nations with less orders for raw material are devastated, from Chile to Congo. As we said, this is going to have political repercussions. People are angry. They're going to demand do something of the government. We don't really care what you do, do something. And so in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt is elected because he promises to try everything. He didn't really have a plan. A lot of people think Roosevelt had a plan. He admitted he didn't have a plan, but he also said he would try all sorts of things. A lot of his things failed. A few of them made things worse, but he did enough things that made things better for enough people, because he basically threw every idea he had at the problem until he found something that helped. The reality is, though, that the New Deal, which was Roosevelt's program, is not going to solve the Depression. Even as late as the late 1930s, you still had 25% unemployment, which is pretty devastating. So it helped some folks. It got some people back to work. It got some people by. But recovery, frankly, will come from World War II. War puts everybody to work. The war tends to be good for economies, unless you lose it or get bombed or die. So it's sort of like having brain cancer and saying, well, if we cut your head off, you won't have brain cancer. True statement. Yeah, but the cure might be worse than the problem. So World War II will put everybody back to work because there's a job for everybody in wartime. But that's how severe the Depression was. That there really was. It was really something that was unprecedented in economic history. So European nations already had some social welfare, which they expand somewhat as much as they can. Again, if you're not, country's not making money, you don't have a lot of tax dollars to spend on helping people. In fact, you're probably losing money out of your government. In Britain, actually all the parties formed a unity government. They set aside their differences, they joined together and made a joint government. I won't get into the details why this is more easy to do in a parliamentary system. But the Labour Party, Liberal Party, and Conservative Party formed a unity government, which would last until 1945 through the twin crises of the Depression and World War II. Generally dominated by the Conservatives, but all the parties cooperating. In other nations, some people turned to violence. There are riots. Even in America, there were some major riots during this time period. Some countries think Marxism is the answer and experiment with that idea, and others will turn to ultra-nationalist and fascist groups. One of the key thinkers during this time period, though, is a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, who writes a book called The General Theory on Unemployment in 1936. Very exciting book. Wait for the movie. I'm sure it'll star like Brad Pitt and other famous people. No, it won't. Economy books are boring, but they are significant in their ideas. So here's Keynes' ideas in a nutshell. And I will tell you that these are the ideas underneath our economy to this day. Keynes' big idea is that laissez-faire doesn't work, but neither does Marxism. Capitalism is a good system, but not laissez-faire, total hands-off, social Darwinist. It's a jungle out there. Hope you survive. If not, too bad. Not that kind of capitalism. In some ways, it connects back to Adam Smith's teachings that the government did have a role to play to make sure that there was justice and empathy in society, even if people were living in a free market world. And so Keynes says, look, the government must be part of the capitalist system. That capitalism left completely without any controls leads to these big ups and downs. Keynes' goal is how can we smooth the roller coaster of business cycles into a more steady, gradual climb rather than these drastic ups followed by drastic drops. One of the things Keynes says is you've got to print more money. In those days, they printed money based on the gold standard. The problem is people have babies faster than they dig up gold. So essentially, there was less and less money to go around every year. Keynes said, look, money really represents the value of what people do. So let's print money consistent with the production of a country. Not too much, you get inflation, but not too little because you get deflation. Don't tie it to the pile of gold sitting in Fort Knox. Print it and coin it based on what a country is actually producing. Secondly, in bad times, don't worry about going in debt. One of the things that President Hoover, the Republican president when the Depression started, one of the things he did was actually to step in and help people with government programs. That was actually Hoover's idea, not Franklin Roosevelt's. But Hoover stopped those programs when the government ran out of money. Well, the government didn't have enough money to help enough people. So Hoover wasn't against helping people, he just didn't have enough money. Keynes says, and Roosevelt did this, don't worry about having enough money. You're the government. Borrow money. Borrow money you don't have. Because look, the boat is going down. You need to patch the boat. Worry about how you'll pay for the patch later. Right now, you need to borrow money. You use that money to create programs that put people back to work, not to give away, although you might have to do a little bit of that, but better to create programs that put people to work. Put them to work for the government. What does government do? Well, you could build roads, you could build new schools, build infrastructure that not only puts people back to work, but gives them some pride and sense of self-worth, and will be there for a long time as a benefit to the community afterwards. So that's his third thing. Make work programs to improve infrastructure. Number 4, you've got to stop overproduction. So sometimes government, US government today will buy excess food and then give the food away to poor countries or poor people. By buying that food, they take it out of the free market. so that farmers don't overproduce themselves out of existence. So he says, look, if something's being overproduced, sometimes the government has to coordinate a way to be smarter about that. You'd like merchants to do that on their own, and most of the time they will, but sometimes they don't. For instance, right now, if you watch the news, there's an oil crisis because two countries decided to overproduce oil and drive the price down, trying to drive each other out of business, the Saudis and the Russians. But that means the whole oil market around the world is flooded and prices are collapsing. Good for you and me at the pump, bad if you live in a town that depends on oil money to put food on your table. 5, regulate banks and finance, stock markets, stockbrokers, to prevent them from lying, from making stupid loans and wasting my money, loaning money they shouldn't. So that's why banks and stockbrokers now have strict rules about who they can loan to and who qualifies. And even to prevent mistakes by corporations that may, if they fail, will not just drag themselves down, but take down whole communities and even damage the economy. And last, he said, tax the rich more than the poor and use that money to create social safety nets. During the Depression, the United States expanded unemployment and created Social Security, pensions for old people. Now, European countries had done this earlier in history. The United States did it during the Depression. By the way, Keynes said, during good times, then you should pay back the money you borrowed, cut back government programs, and try to save money for a rainy day. This is the piece that government rarely does. Unfortunately, we get addicted to goodies from the government, so in good times we want the goodies that come, but we don't like paying taxes. What does that mean? In bad times like now, we don't have a pot of money to take care of emergencies. So all this money in the coronavirus situation that the government's giving away, that's going to come out of your pocket for the next 30 years because we spent our money and borrowed money when times were good instead of saving it and taxing people when times are good to have a rainy day fund. What does that mean? Your national debt just went through the roof. Don't blame that on Keynes. Keynes said when times are good, cut back on programs, increase taxes, save your money. When times are bad, you have the money to help the poor. If you got to borrow some, you can pay it back when good times return. Instead, politicians for 70 years just borrow, 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 spend, spend, spend. You don't believe it? Go look at the national debt. All right, so that, boys and girls, concludes this lecture on the Great Depression. As we said, some of the responses had to do with politics. And we'll see in the next lecture how people in Germany and Italy and other parts of the world, Japan, will turn to fascists. Other people think that communism is the answer. And frankly, in America, there was a huge boom in communism, and there was even an American Nazi party. But fortunately, Roosevelt did enough, imperfect as it may have been, so that we did not have a major revolution. Other countries are not going to be so lucky. Take care. Scrub your hands. See you next time.